So it is my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Kristin Andrews. She is York Research Chair in Philosophy of Animal Minds, Professor of Philosophy at York University here in Toronto, and her academic awards include being elected a member of the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars, Artists and Scientists in 2015. Dr. Andrews has published several books on philosophy and animals, mostly focused on animal minds, but one co-written with a small group of philosophers on chimpanzees and legal personhood. She has also co-edited a Routledge handbook on the philosophy of animal minds. It's awesome. And authored or co-authored, and I mean numerous articles, on the philosophy of animal minds or agency. Dr. Andrews excels at bringing together the latest findings in empirical animal studies and philosophical reflections on their significance. In fact, I can't think of anyone else in philosophy that does it as well as Dr. Andrews. Her book, The Animal Mind, An Introduction to the Philosophy of Animal Cognition, that's in its second edition from Routledge, is an unrivaled introduction to the philosophy of animal minds with a wealth of empirical animal studies to supplement and challenge highlighted philosophical approaches to animal consciousness, rationality and thought, communication, social knowledge, culture, and more. If you haven't read it, you should. Today's presentation reflects Dr. Andrews' interest in non-human animal social norms and what they mean for conservation as well as animal welfare. Please help me give a hearty welcome to Dr. Andrews.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrew, for that embarrassing introduction. He's my biggest fan, so I think that was pretty obvious. Thanks so much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here today with you all to talk about a project that I'm working on right now in a number of different dimensions and that I'm really excited about. So the question I want to raise today with you all is whether animals have social norms, how can we tell if animals have social norms, and why does it matter if animals do have social norms? This is part of an interdisciplinary collaboration I'm engaged in with other philosophers who are working on the theoretical side of things, as well as with scientists with whom we're developing experiments to test some of these ideas. So let me see if this works. All right. Oh, this way? Yes. Okay, so a popular line today is that only humans are normative agents who have social norms, those often informal rules that structure human behavior, regulating what is appropriate, required, prohibited, or permitted. As you can see, even the definition on its face presumes that social norms are human unique. Social norms are group-level properties that have been enjoying a lot of attention in philosophy and anthropology and sociology in recent years. This research is focused on human social norms, hence the kind of innocent anthropocentrism you see in definitions like this. However, there are an ever-growing number of theorists who place social norm development as the turning point in hominid evolution, alongside explicit arguments that only humans have social norms, and this is what makes us special. So for example, Michael Tomasello's recent book, The Evolution of Agency, Behavioral Organization from Lizards to Humans, he argues that only humans have normative agency, which involves social regulation in terms of reputation and obligation to others, shared intentionality, and the capacity to regulate oneself. On this view, social norms only emerge once we get normative agents, and chimpanzees and lizards and squirrels lack this sort of agency. Another very recent example comes from Victor Kumar and Richmond Campbell's book, A Better Ape, in which they suggest that great apes may have had cooperative regularities. This would be a practice like dividing meat after a hunt in some sort of a fair distribution, but they don't count that as a social norm. A cooperative regularity of this sort would only become a social norm once the practice was recognized and acknowledged as the kind of practice that we do. So it requires a certain kind of reflection and self-knowledge that they think that non-human animals lack. The arguments for the human uniqueness of social norms all tend to focus on the kind of cognitive and affective capacities that are thought to be required for having social norms. So for example, Philippe Rocher traces norms to uniquely human forms of self-consciousness. Joe Henrich attributes the secret to our success to a particular human unique kind of gene-culture coevolution. Jonathan Birch and Kim Sterelny argue that social norms evolved from cognitive control mechanisms that allowed our hominid ancestors to do things like create really good hand axes. All of these kinds of proposals vary in their details about what the actual kind of linchpin is, but they all agree that having social norms requires a kind of a mind that only humans have. Now, there are a couple ways to push back on these sorts of anthropocentric claims about human norms, about social norms in animals. First, we could point out that the skeptics all disagree with one another about what is the important cognitive capacity for having social norms, right? That there isn't, in fact, any agreed upon view here. I'm not going to take that line this morning. Instead, I'm going to focus on another path and offer a way of operationalizing the notion of social norms that allows all of the individuals involved in this research to agree that we're identifying the same phenomenon of interest. Right? So rather than making any presupposition about the kinds of cognitive capacities that are involved, we can say, what is this phenomenon in a way that we can describe it behaviorally. This framework builds on work I've done with Evan Westra, published in a 2022 paper. It makes only minimal assumptions about the psychological capacities required for having social norms, and it opens the door to investigating what we might call candidate social norms in non-human animals. So, right, there must be candidate social norms. There might be things that might make us think, oh, maybe animals have social norms in order to even get this investigation off the ground. So what are some of the things that we see animals doing that make us think maybe they have social norms? Well, to start, we can look at the social hierarchies that exist in many animal species, which constrain behaviors as different individuals play different roles. We can look at play behavior, which exists in many species, and it's often described as having rules about what to do in the right sort of context, rules about signaling playful intent, and handicapping when playing with a weaker partner. We also have observations of the sort that are illustrated on the slide here. We have observations of species who immigrate after sexual maturity, who pay costs to conform to the traditions of their new group. So this picture up here shows vervet monkeys who grew up eating one color of corn and not eating the other color of corn, even though they were both provisioned to them. And so the blue eating monkeys, when they immigrated to a pink eating group, they stopped eating blue corn and started eating the pink corn. This is a costly behavior because they have blue corn right there. They've been eating it all their life. It gives them a lot of nutrients, and yet they don't do it anymore to conform to the behavior of their new group. So this is one example of a behavior that looks like a social norm. This is another example with capuchin monkeys of a behavior that looks like social norm. Again, a behavior that is costly in a certain respect. So in this one community of capuchin monkeys, Susan Perry and colleagues observed this risky game of monkeys putting fingers in one another's eye sockets and up their nostrils and swaying together in this really relaxed fashion, which is an unusual behavior for capuchin monkeys, and yet something that seemed to affect the social bonds of the individuals who participated in this risky game. And then in this final example, just like humans have fashion trends, whereas everyone is, I don't even know what's cool anymore, but like all the students at York are wearing whatever they're wearing these days. This community of chimpanzees in a sanctuary all started wearing a piece of straw in their ear after the alpha female started wearing the straw in the ear. So fashion trends, food preferences, risky kind of social games, these are all sorts of things that really evoke this idea of social norms in non-human animal species. All right, so I said that I'm going to offer a construct that will help us move forward in understanding whether things like this might be social norms. So the construct that I have in mind, we call a normative regularity. And we describe this as a socially maintained pattern of behavioral conformity within a community. So with this construct in hand, we can identify the phenomena of interest in a way that we hope different theorists with different theories about the psychology of social norms, that they can all agree on. And from this starting point, we can investigate the types of normative regularities and the different kinds of psychological and social factors that may be involved in having, creating, and following norms in different communities. So let me just briefly unpack this construct. So by community, we're simply referring to the target group, however it's defined. Kristina Bicchiari calls this the reference class in her account of social norms, and that's a helpful way of thinking about it because it's the group to which the behavioral pattern is indexed, however that group is defined. So in the case of non-human animals, it might be defined in terms of the primatologists who've studied that particular community might identify what counts as the group versus another group, or a biologist studying whales or cetaceans of different varieties, different species might be determining what counts as a group. By pattern of behavioral conformity, we mean to distinguish social norms from merely prescriptive norms that are rarely followed, though both Michelle Gelfand's tight and loose norms would count as patterns of the sort we have in mind. Right? There's still a pattern of crossing at crosswalks in loose Toronto, even though you may notice that you can walk across the street with impunity anywhere you want. You still see people gathered at the corners waiting for the light to change to cross the street when there's not a lot of traffic. And then by socially maintained, we have in mind what norm theorists usually refer to as punishment or sanctions, or how we distinguish descriptive or statistical regularities from normative ones. And this is really the key notion in this construct. So our notion of social maintenance has a wider lens than the lens of punishment, and it includes positive as well as negative social reinforcement. What that means is that conformity behaviors can be rewarded and nonconformity can be met with some kind of social pressure. I'm going to have more to say about this aspect of the construct later, but I think this should do for now. So normative regularities, just to put it on the table, are not meant to be a conceptual analysis of norms. What they're meant to do is offer a tool that will allow us to investigate a few behaviors that we see in non-human animal societies, but also allow us to investigate behaviors in human societies as well. So as promised, I want to start with 3 examples of behaviors that animals have engaged in and ask what we would need to know whether to determine whether they're normative regularities. I should also point out that the examples I'm using in this talk all come from primates. This is not at all to suggest that I think it's only primates where we would find social norms. It is just where we have been focusing because as Andrew often puts it, it's the low-hanging fruit. It's the case in which we have a lot of research. We have a lot of data that we can work with, and so we can focus on that taxa. Though some other people like Rachel Powell argues that the strongest evidence for social norms in non-human animals come from the eusocial insects like ants and bees. And I think that while it's not maybe better than the evidence I'm about to provide for you, it is also very strong evidence. So I'm going to give you 3 cases of primates. In this first case, this is a Balinese macaque who's a robber-barter. This behavior, this robber-barter behavior, has arisen at a number of temples on the island of Bali and has been extensively studied at the Uluwatu temple in Bali. So the Uluwatu temple has for a long time been a place of worship for the Balinese people. It's important to their religion, and the monkeys are considered sacred and are allowed to live at the temple, and the local people have worked very nicely and gotten along very well with the monkeys at this temple. But more recently, Bali has been the site of intensive tourism, as you may have heard about or experienced yourself. And the monkeys are not just dealing with Balinese people who know them well and have established certain sorts of norms, perhaps, but that's not the norm I'm interested in. They're confronted with tourists who don't really know how to interact with the monkeys. And so what the monkeys have started doing is stealing objects from tourists, only tourists, not local people, but from the tourists. They steal water bottles, they steal sunglasses, they steal hats, they will steal your cell phone and your camera too. And so once this stealing behavior started developing, the temple staff members would trade food objects that they were provisioning the monkeys with already for these stolen objects. So the monkeys get provisioned with sweet potatoes and corn, sometimes bananas. Bananas are highly regarded food items. Sweet potatoes are less highly regarded food items. And sometimes it's been reported that the monkeys, if they steal something that seems to be really valuable, like a cell phone that the tourist is very upset about, they will go up to a temple guard and be offered a sweet potato in exchange, and they're like, nope, throw it away. Wait for that banana, and then drop the phone, grab the banana, and run off. So this robber barter behavior has developed in this community. It's a behavior that seems to be in existence between the temple guards and the monkeys, because the monkeys know that if they exchange this item that they've stolen, they'll get a food item in return. And there might be some sort of a social pressure there when they're rejecting, or a thought about a rule when they're rejecting a food item that's not a high enough value. Now, whether this is actually a normative regularity within the macaque community is a question that we don't yet have an answer to. What would we need evidence of? We'd need evidence of something like robber barterers being higher status than the monkeys that don't engage in the robber barter behavior. This is a socially learned behavior. It's not a behavior that every member of the community does. And so looking at the development of this behavior in the different groups could answer our question about whether this is a normative regularity. All right, the second example is an example of chimpanzees in a zoo in the Netherlands. So the females in this community engage in this behavior called a cross-armed walk. You can see that it's kind of awkward to walk on 3 legs instead of on 4. You're slower, you're less efficient. But it's a behavior that had been established since the 1990s in this community. So 2 female chimpanzees, Moni and Erica, were introduced into this community. And after 2 days, Moni started imitating this cross-armed walk. Erica, however, did not start imitating this cross-armed walk. And so because there was this difference in the behavior of the 2 chimpanzees, the researchers decided to do a social embeddedness analysis of Moni and Erica. And what they found was that Moni, the chimpanzee who conformed, was much more well integrated into the group than Erica was. So this is suggestive that there might have been a social reward that came from engaging in the cross-armed walk that Moni got and Erica did not get. Of course, if you want to study whether this behavior is actually socially maintained as opposed to Erica just liking to imitate and also being more friendly, you would want to perhaps integrate more chimpanzees in the community and then record how other individuals responded during the first instance of the conformity behavior and whether there was any kind of social rewards for that. All right, and then the final example is a case reported by Hawkins and colleagues of male chimpanzees who repeatedly steal crops from the town of Bossou in Guinea. So they go into a town, they're very nervous and scared. It seems to be a very stressful thing to do, and then they'll steal papayas. They bring the papayas back to the forest and they share them. Now this is strange because chimpanzees aren't known for sharing food. The wild food that they collect is not shared. And so why are they sharing this very hard-won human food? Well, the researchers suggest that there might be a reciprocal food for sex rule at play here. Because when you share really good quality papaya with a female partner, they see that there's more likelihood that the female is going to be willing to have sex with the male. after that. Is that a way of reinforcing a norm? Well, maybe, or maybe it's just, oh, you like somebody who gives you presents, and it's not a norm indeed. To look and see whether their social maintenance evolved, we could do things like ask whether males who request sex from a female that they gave food to, in this case, and don't get it, if they're more angry than a male who requests sex and doesn't get it in another kind of context where they didn't provision the papayas. So these are the sorts of cases that we have that I think offer some evidence of normative regularities in primates, but we need stronger evidence. So this is the kind of evidence I want to leave you with. And what I want to turn to now is the kind of theoretical worries. So we need to do research. That's great. There are theoretical worries, though, about the sorts of constructs and the sorts of cases that I've been looking at, and whether or not they should count as social norms, normative regularities understood as pointing to social norms. Looking at those two, oh, see, I didn't have the video running, sorry. So yes, they're sharing a papaya, isn't that sweet? All right, so worries about the normative regularity construct. There are two main ones. One is that if we don't see punishment in these sorts of communities, then we really can't say what they have as a social norm, because punishment is key. And the second objection is still, we need to have some more psychology than you've allowed in order to have something like social norms. So let's look at those. The punishment objection comes from cultural anthropology, who generally hold that third-party punishment played a really important role in the evolution of human norm systems by stabilizing cooperative norms at the community level. And this has led to philosophical models of norms as taking punishment and motivation to punish norm violators, an intrinsic motivation to punish norm violators as a key aspect of the norm system itself. The prominent role of punishment in these sorts of views has led to some skepticism about the existence of norms in non-human animal societies, especially in the primate societies, given that research in the lab that have tried to evoke punishment behavior have failed to do so. So setting up an individual animal to look like they're doing something wrong, or to actually do something that might be considered wrong, and the other animal who was harmed has an opportunity to punish them, yes, you'll see second-party retaliation. But if the mother is watching her infant be harmed, she doesn't do anything in these lab studies. So you might think, oh, there's no punishment. The mom's not even going to go after the guy who's stealing food from her kid? Okay, there must be no norms. Though field researchers argue that they see punishment in naturalistic settings all the time. So this is an empirical question that I think is still outstanding. And I don't want to talk about the empirical evidence, because I think it's really important to think both about what punishment is and how important punishment is. So it isn't always clear what's meant by punishment. In the ape literature, punishment is taken to require paying a cost in order to retaliate against a transgressor, and that third-party punishment is when the one who pays the cost to punish the transgressor is an individual who wasn't harmed, and the punishment itself has to take some sort of physical, aggressive form. So this is a narrow view of punishment, and it isn't reflected in how punishment is described in the anthropological literature. So for example, Kelly and Setman write that enforcement and punishment are broad categories and can include correcting, withholding cooperation, communicating disapproval through body language, or explicit criticism, ostracizing, gossiping, or even physical violence. And Kristin Bicchiari writes that the reaction to nonconformity can range from slight displeasure to what she says is extreme punishment. So there's a much more inclusive account of what punishment is in the human literature, I think is causing the skeptics to not see punishment behavior that might exist in the animal case. It's also, I think, important to recognize that in the human case, punishments don't always have to be costly at all. But in fact, I can gain things from punishing another individual. So for example, if I'm gossiping with Andrew about a famous transgressor, it might bring me and Andrew close if he agrees with me. I'm like, oh, you think that too? Yeah, it was horrible. I can't believe he did that. It's not going to harm the famous transgressor who doesn't know that we're gossiping about him, but it brings us closer. So we can get positive rewards. And we also see this in some small-scale societies where there are rules such as if an individual transgresses a norm, then you are free to steal from them and their family. So the punisher is gaining goods by stealing from the family that housed the norm violator. The other thing that I want to point out is that some punishments take the form of restorative justice practices, in which a transgressor's actions are noted, but the parties come together to repair the damaged relationship. And restorative justice may be preferred in small-scale societies where the risks of punishment are too great and the costs involved in punishment or ostracizing someone who might be a valuable member of the community is not a cost that the community wants to bear. And restorative justice practices like reconciliation might be things that we're seeing in non-human great ape societies, and something that Frans de Waal has talked about for many years. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, punishment is only one way in which individuals can socially maintain a behavioral pattern. Another way we can socially maintain a behavioral pattern is through rewards for conformity. So one of my favorite go-to examples would be if you are teaching a child a norm and they violate it, like for example, eating soup with their hand, you're not going to punish the child. You might give them a spoon, right? You might correct the behavior. You might model the behavior. So there are these kind of pedagogical responses that we can give to norm violations as well. We can also engage in positive social maintenance through touch, slight touches that might look like reconciliation after policing a norm, or social rewards like being included in cooperative activities, partner choice, positive social relations, increased social status. These are all like importantly under-theorized kinds of behaviors that are essential for learning norms in the first place. Punishment is perhaps the last recourse, a kind of punitive punishment with violence is perhaps the last recourse when these other sort of positive behaviors to reinforce a pattern fail. So if there's a benefit to nonconformity, then there's going to be a cost. If there's a benefit to conformity, there's going to be a cost to nonconformity. And when we're looking for evidence of social maintenance in non-human animals, the strongest evidence would come from both responses to violators and responses to conformers. And this is the sort of work that I'm doing with primatologists when we're trying to, in the lab and also in the field, look at gathering this sort of evidence in great apes. All right, so now let's turn to the psychological objection. The psychological objection to normative regularity construct raises a general worry that the construct will include behaviors that are not guided by the right psychological mechanisms. Those like Tomasello, who are worried that social norms require shared intentionality, are going to be upset with the kinds of examples that I gave you before. So, right, Moni is maybe just friendlier, and that's why she imitates, and that's why she's more socially embedded. The robber barter macaques, maybe they just all like to steal the food, and they're like Margaret Gilbert's individuals who all run to the shelter when it starts to rain. It might look like it's a group pattern of behavior, but all the humans just have the same goal of getting out of the rain and don't really care what anyone else is doing. Maybe that's what the robber barter macaques are doing as well. The general objection can be stated like this. A true social norm only exists when members of a community share a certain psychological state. So any attempt to operationalize the norms we do will ultimately fail to identify the phenomenon of interest. The kind of state required on these accounts involves understanding the mental states of others. Tomasello's requirement of shared intentionality is one way. Cristina Bicchiari's requirement of normative expectations is another. She says that, that normative agents have the belief that others also believe that community members ought to follow the rule, so that normative agents have beliefs about beliefs, requiring a theory of mind, which is a capacity that is still controversial, to say the least, whether it exists in non-human animal species. We might also say that what is really needed here is this understanding that the animals are following a rule, not just engaged in a pattern of behavior. What might look like a rule to us might just be a pattern to them. And when we say things like, oh, chimpanzees have a rule against mishandling infants, we might just be describing what chimpanzees do. And it's no more a norm than saying that apple trees have a rule against developing rust disease, just because they have natural defenses to fight it. So I think the key to answering this kind of worry is to note that the difference between developing a disease and roughly treating an agent or an infant is only that the latter is an example of behavior. Patterns that arise from behavior are agential patterns, the result of cognitive beings deciding what to do. Comparative cognition scientists call the capacity to do things differently in the same situation behavioral flexibility, and it's sometimes seen as the hallmark of cognition and required for learning. Behavioral flexibility and learning are thought to be widespread across species, from fruit flies to chimpanzees, and it counts as a minimal psychological requirement that we can understand our normative regularity construct to include. So when we say that a normative regularity is a pattern of behavior, we're already taking the pattern to be one that emerges from an agent. All right. The patterns of behavior seen in animal communities differ from the descriptive patterns in other parts of the natural world because these patterns are socially learned. And socially learned behaviors are not always transparent, even to humans. So take the example of proximity norms. We have a proximity norm. You may or may not be aware of the fact that 46 centimeters is the amount of space that I should stand from Andrew in order to not make him feel really uncomfortable. And so we obey these norms because we socially learned it from our culture. If you're in North America, that's your norm. If you're from somewhere else, it's not your norm. Your norm is some other number. And yet we maybe couldn't have said what the distance is. Maybe you didn't even know that there was a standing distance norm. Probably you all do, but it's, at some age, children are following these norms, but they don't know that they exist. So this suggests that there are lots of human norms without these kind of cognitive capacities that people like Bicchiari and Tomasello are suggesting are required here. Proximity norms are just one example. There's so many norms like greeting norms, whether you shake hands or kiss or hug. These are things that individuals do because it's how they do things, how we do things. It's just the way it is. But if someone does it differently, there's some sort of a feeling of wrongness. There's some sort of an awkwardness there. So humans are also socially learning these behaviors that are social norms, but are not reflected on in this sort of a way. Okay, so I hope to have convinced you that the psychological worry is also not of concern. There's one perhaps lingering worry, and that is that the construct is too permissive and it includes behaviors that we wouldn't even consider to be social norms to begin with. So consider the so-called Mormon marching band crickets. These are crickets who during their swarming periods will just march through an area and eat all of the grasses and vegetation that they see in front of them. And so it's a behavioral pattern of marching, all swarming together, eating nutrients. What happens if a cricket doesn't follow the pattern? Well, social maintenance kicks in and the cricket behind them eats them. So cannibalism is the mechanism of social maintenance in these marching band crickets. So it seems like the marching band crickets fits our account of normative regularities better than the chimpanzees did. Isn't this a problem for the construct? Well, Evan and I say no. We think that this is actually a beautiful example of what the construct can do for us, because the construct is a starting place to identify a range of different sorts of behaviors that are socially maintained, but that might have different dimensions. And the different dimensions that we can see within this construct of behavioral regularity will allow theorists who have different interests and different goals, perhaps goals about norm change or goals about norm creation or goals about education, can identify what the dimensions are in the norms that they are particularly concerned with. And so in some work under review right now, Evan Westra, Simon Fitzpatrick, and I have proposed that it would be very useful to identify these 6 different dimensions of normative regularities, both for work in human norms and work in animal norms. We can look at different psychological dimensions and different social dimensions. And using these dimensions, we can in fact draw models of what the norm profiles look like for different species. So for example, we can draw a norm profile for ants as a species or number of species. We can draw a norm profile for chimpanzees. We can also draw norm profiles for humans at a certain developmental stage, like 3-year-old human children. And we can also use the dimensions to get the profiles of specific norms, like the macaque robber barter behavior, or like things that are of interest to people who work on norm change, like open defecation. What supports that particular norm might be very different from what supports other sorts of norms. So we hope that this is going to be a really useful construct that will allow us to do lots of valuable things, both within human norms and in animal norms. Now, I said finally, the third thing I want to talk about is why you should care. Maybe I should have started with that because it would have motivated you to pay attention to me. But I'm going to end on that. So what are some of the practical implications of looking at or thinking about social norms in non-human animals? There are 3. First, normative regularities could turn out to be a useful tool for conservation efforts. Much of human-wildlife conflict involves trying to get groups of animals to change their behavior, to stop raiding fruit gardens, or to stop traveling through villages. Attempts to stop elephants in Thailand by using bee fences and explosives don't seem to be working very well. And so I've been talking with Joshua Plotnick, who works with on elephant cognition in the field in Thailand. We've been talking about how to study these elephants from the perspective of social norms in order to figure out whether there's a social norm that supports these sorts of behaviors and if there could be a way to intervene in the norm, to change the norm after creating a norm dimension in this case. Second, normative regularities may support animal welfare goals that we have in our treatment of captive animals. Interactions between human caretakers and captive animals may create normative regularities. For instance, regularities surrounding feeding, treatment by caretakers, and so on. And they may cause potential harm to animals when we violate them intentionally or unintentionally. Groups of captive animals can also create their own normative regularities that become important to the group, even if they are somehow harmful or have high costs. So for example, what if eating feces or other potentially harmful behavior in a group of captive chimpanzees is just how we do things around here? It's just the important cultural behavior that, like a cross-armed walk, becomes really important. And if caregivers intervene and try to stop the chimpanzees from eating feces or stops an immigrant from eating feces when they come into that group, they may be disrupting the social structure in a way. Of course, there are harmful social norms and cultural behaviors in human communities. We pierce our skin and we tattoo our body and we smoke cigarettes and do sorts of things too. So not everything is like helpful when it's just because it's a social norm, obviously. I think we all know that. Also, I think normative regularities could support animal welfare by considering how to integrate new animals into a community. So if there are social norms in this community, we can in a way guide the immigrants to learn the social norms or help facilitate them learning the social norms in creative sorts of ways. All right, and then finally, the existence of normative regularities in animals has potential implications with respect to moral status. For the most part, arguments for animal moral standing are grounded in animals' psychological capacities. The welfarist utilitarian approaches focus on sentience. The rights-based capacities approach focus on cognitive capacities related to personhood. What these views might overlook are the reasons to grant moral standing to animals who are living in the world of values and whose interests may extend beyond avoiding pain or exercising autonomy. So thanks very much for your attention. I look forward to discussing with you. Yeah.
So we're going to switch to the Q&A. My pencil can roll into. Can everybody hear me? Can you want me to take it out? No, how about that? Is that good? Okay. Louder? Is it on? Is that good? Is that good? So I'll just open with a couple of questions, although I have a cricket question that I want to ask, and I'm going to just bite my tongue on that one and maybe ask it in the break if I don't have a chance to do it. And so I've got one on the moral status too, and I'll just jump in with that if folks are shy. So here's the first one. So you talked about nuisance behavior in interspecific contexts, right? So you got wildlife conflicts in various contexts. So you get the robber barter, which I love that example. And you got crop raiding. I mean, we see this around the world with elephants, chimpanzees. And so you're wondering about whether normative regularity or social norming framing can actually help us redo those. So I think that's a great framing. And so I think of Mary Midgley's discussions of culture and criticizing culture, because this intersects quite strongly with emergent cultures in some kind of broad sense of that. And so Mary Midgley, and if you haven't read any Mary Midgley, I recommend trying out Your New Sword. It's a lovely little essay. But she goes, listen, if you're going to praise cultures, you need to do it for good reasons. That means if you're going to praise cultures for good reasons, there can also be good reasons to criticize. Now, it might be easier to do this with interspecific communities. So you've got humans, like the robber barter macaques. You've got, I take it, the temple guards are kind of there. This is an interspecific community. They're very bonded with the macaques, vice versa. Clearly, there's norms that seem to be emerging here. There are at least normative regularities that are emerging here on your frame. But if we think of these as nuisance behaviors that may have problematic cultural products, or aspects, can we imagine a space, interspecific or even just among conspecifics of other animals, criticizing their cultural norms or social norms or even normative regularities?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that it's really important to point out that not just because it's a norm, it's something that we need to preserve. So this is in the case of the welfare sort of considerations. If you've got a norm in place and it's actually really harmful and individuals are killing others, then yes, intervention is going to be important. In these case of conflicts, animal-human conflicts, the decision has to be made and warranted, that it has to be warranted that intervention is necessary. I think there's a certain amount of nuisance behaviors that maybe humans just have to suck up and deal with, right? So in Toronto, we have a lot of raccoons in a lot of our garbage cans. And they're just kind of, other members of Toronto community, and we just live with the raccoons. It's a little bit of a pain to clean up your garbage cans every once in a while because they got into it, but it doesn't seem to be causing huge conflicts. It's when the behavior is really a risk to the animals as well as the humans. In some cases, you might think what we really need to do is change the human behavior, though. So for example, in the robber barter case, the behavior to change might actually not be the macaque behavior. It might be the temple guard behavior. Right? The temple guards are the one who are offering the food. And if the temple guards say, oh, I'm not going to offer the food, maybe that was a bad idea. Maybe that really just ended up reinforcing a behavior. And now next thing I know, I'm going to be looking at wallets and trying to trade a banana for a wallet. It's the animals who are doing fine in this case. In other cases, like some of the crop raiding cases where animals are getting shot by humans, again, like stop shooting the animals. This is like pretty, it seems like the burden should be on the humans. But if the humans are not changing their behavior, then conservationists might say, we need to work on changing the animal behavior because they're not safe.
Yeah, so I'm detecting a resistance to criticizing. So within cultures, so think of macaque cultures, chimpanzee cultures, perhaps cricket cultures. Would you be, because some people talk in terms of praising other animal cultures. Mm-hmm. You see this occasionally. Mary Midgley would warn about that. You better be doing that for good reasons if you want to do that respectfully. But that allows for the other side. That's the double-edged sword, the trying out the new sword. Are you resistant to criticizing normative regularities within other animals? So heterospecifics and only heterospecifics. It doesn't involve humans. I'm running into the problems in the terminology. So members of the same species. So communities of members of the same species. Are you hesitant to criticize? Would you be hesitant to praise?
Yeah, I think that my project right now is not to make the normative judgments about whether animal normative practices are good or bad. I do think that there's a lot of people in ethics who are working on that, and especially in the wild animal ethics field, are looking at whether animal behavior should be described, wild animal behavior should be described as worthy of praise or good. And there's a nice distinction between those two that Alia Dewey and Reese Borchardt just made in a biology and philosophy paper. So you could check that out. They argue we can praise animals and animal behavior without judging it as morally good.
Thanks for that. One more question. So I was watching a short film. I don't know if you've seen it, 73 Cows.
No.
It's a UK short film. A farmer inherits an animal farm from, I think, a dead parent who left it to him. He's a vegetarian. They have cows they're raising for protein. He really struggles with sending these cows to slaughter, and so they eventually get them to sanctuary. And he talks in terms of betrayal that often gets framed in terms of friendship when I see it in animal ethics literature. But I can't help thinking your framing does this really well too for normative regularities, behavioral expectancies or expectations, from the cattle to the farmer and back. Because, cattle, I used to milk cows every so often had a friend who's a dairy farm, and so have milk cows and have strong views about how they'll be treated. And so you can imagine a back and forth here of behavioral expectations. Do you think your framing can actually nicely capture this sense of betrayal? When you use the term friendship, people will have this reaction like they do with punishment, right? They just like friendship with other animals. They'll bring in Aristotle and, talk about the problems of asymmetry and this sort of stuff and certain kinds of cognitive capacities. Do you think your notion of normative regularities might actually be able to better capture the sense of betrayal that kind of farmer had in sending cows that he was bonded with, and they seemed to trust him, and then they would in trust they would go onto the trailer and then into a nightmare abattoir.
Yeah, I do think that the normative regularity construct can be used in that sort of a case to identify a value that is different from the sorts of values that might have been identified from, say, a welfarist perspective, right? So the same sort of like end result occurs if an animal is slaughtered, and the same sort of handling and the same sort of living conditions and everything else is the same. But what's different is this thing that's less obvious, that might require a certain kind of lens to see.
Yeah.
And I think the normative regularity construct and thinking about social norms in non-human animals allows us to see animal societies in ways that we might not have seen them. I mean, maybe you all already see them in this way. So I may be talking to the wrong audience, but in many cases, people wouldn't have seen it. So it's just trying to bring to light certain things.
Thanks. So let's, more questions, I'll throw them in if folks are shy, but who wants to ask a question?
Thanks so much for this fascinating talk. It was really, really interesting. I'm really interested in personhood as part of my research, so these topics really fascinate me. And sometimes we always kind of hear people in the animal world saying that a lot of societies are complex, like animal societies are complex. So how could a society be complex without social norms, without recognizing that they have social norms? Like, I imagine that Tomasello considers that chimp societies are complex. So how are they complex if we don't recognize that they have these social norms? Additionally, like animal societies that are structured upon like an alpha leader, where the others respect that alpha and don't challenge the alpha until a certain point, like wolves, or maybe when there's an alpha female, like elephants. Are these examples of societies, are these like that structure, could it be an example of a social norm? And my last question really quick is, there's this book that came out last year that's called The Bonobo Sisterhood, where they use a case of bonobo females that cry out when a male is attacking her. So the other females come to the rescue and defend her, and then they isolate the male. So in that case, the punishment objection would mean to apply and consider that that is not a social norm in bonobo societies. Would it be to punish the female that does not cooperate defending the attacked female? Or would we get through the objection because they punished the male that attacked the female?
Great, yeah, thanks for these questions. I'll take the last one first. So I think that's a really nice example of the sort of observations field researchers see, where they do observe things like females that are unrelated to an individual who's being harmed, intervening. We see this also in cases of attempted infanticide or when male chimpanzees mishandle infants. And I think that offers quite strong evidence of a normative regularity, that this is a form of punishment if you take that wider view of punishment. But I also think that, yes, if there are different ways, like punishing then the individuals who don't cooperate or don't participate in the intervention would just be, I don't even know if it would be stronger evidence, but it would be evidence of like a different sort of structure and sort of norms, because then there would be meta norms. And so one of the dimensions that Evan Westrow and Simon Fitzpatrick and I were talking about is norms about norms. So we have norms about norms all the time. Like, what do you do when someone doesn't violate a norm? That would be a really good example of a norm about a norm. Yeah. The dominance structure, yes, absolutely. I think that dominance hierarchies is kind of the prima facie reason why we would be looking at social norms in non-human animals. There are ways you're supposed to behave when you're subordinate and when you're dominant. And then the complexity one is really interesting, because I think that the sort of responses you're going to get from folks who are going to go like this, that the physical world is very complex. Physics is very complex, but there's no agency in physics. It's not that these particles are doing what they're doing because they feel like they ought to do it. This is just how the structure works. And when you look at evolution, some people will argue that through time, evolutionary processes create more complexity, though it's not always clear that that makes sense. And this can exist without any sort of intentionality or cognition involved at all. And intentionality and cognition is what's involved, what's required for social norms. And I think I would agree, yes, intentionality and cognition of a certain kind is required for social norms. So I don't think physical particles have them, but I think that we can see them much more broadly, because I think animals are largely sentient, including the crickets, are going to be sentient creatures who are going to have positive and negative affect in response to the things that happen around them. Yeah, thanks.
Question there. Yep.
someone like me who doesn't really know much about your field, but it is very interesting. I'm wondering if you can comment on the whole issue of captivity in your work or the work of your peers. I mean, especially I know right now with the macaques, this is a huge problem internationally. Canada continues apparently to violate the treaties that have been created to try and prevent the importation of them. Is your data mostly generated in the wild, or do you use animals in the lab? And if so, what is your plan to stop doing that?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So, I mean, as a philosopher, I mostly read things. So I'm not, I'm not doing lab research or field research, though I have done some lab research and I have done some field research. I'm basically taking the data from where it exists and using the information in the science that is out there. The kind of advocacy work I've done with people like Andrew and David have called for understanding or reconceptualizing our way of thinking about the non-human animals who are our study subjects in many cases. I've also written a short piece for Aeon magazine with Susanna Monceau, looking at rats as also an animal that needs to be considered to have higher protection, the way that Harlow's work with the primates were really kind of premised both on we're going to harm these animals because they're so much like humans and then make them mentally disordered so that we can figure out how to treat human mental disorders. The same sort of kind of perverse reasoning is going on in the rats. So for me, it's an ongoing conversation that I have with my colleagues who are doing scientific research. We talk about it and we're aware of it, but I'm not involved in any advocacy work on this at this time. Yeah.
Whereas I'm just going to make sure I'm scoping for the whole room.
Thank you. Thank you for this really interesting talk. So my question has to do with what we're measuring as normative regularity. It also relates a little bit to rule following or the objections that are based on rule following. So I'm wondering, when you're measuring normative regularity, are we only measuring behaviors between animals? Like I think the word is conspecific, if I'm using it correctly, or does it apply to interactions between humans and animals as well? And I can give one example if you bear with me. So with our dog companion, when we started taking her up north and hiking, we'd pick these wild blueberries. And this was when she was younger. So she started to eat these blueberries. And now this is what she does. And she doesn't eat any other kind of berries. So I can see that as a kind of pattern following, and that would fall maybe under the objection. But then more recently, like, she's been going to my mother-in-law's garden, and she's been crushing the flowers wherever she lays. And she's used to just laying wherever she wants. But then one day my mother-in-law took her through the garden and showed her places where she could lay. Now this is where she lays. So this seems much more like rule following to me. And so if that counts, or does that count, normative regularity in interactions between humans and animals, or is it just applicable to conspecific behaviors?
All right, great. Thanks for that beautiful example. My answer is yes, it includes interspecific relationships, human-animal relationships. You can find, I think, social norms between different species of animals. They're potentially, so for example, when you've got grouper fish and eels cooperatively hunting, here you have two different species working together. Maybe this would be a place to look for a social norm if one violated their role to play there. I think the dog example is lovely. And I've talked to some of my colleagues who work with dogs about testing for social maintenance of household rules with pet dogs. especially when you bring a second dog into the house who doesn't yet know what the rules are of this house. So does the dog who's lived in this family for a long time help the new dog learn the rules? Can they learn faster if there's another dog in the house? I think that would be a beautiful piece of evidence in favor of dogs understanding the rules and following the rules. Yeah.
I'm going to glance over here, see if there's any hands over here before I go back to the middle, because I know there's some in the middle. Virgin. I think is a mic coming your way.
I think it's a joint question.
It is, it's a
George's
joint question. It was my question, but we agree we both want to ask it. Empirically, how could you tell a rule from a pattern?
How can you tell a rule from a pattern? So the one way in which we're trying to get at this experimentally is through methods that Chris Croupegne and his lab have worked on, looking at pupillometry and thermography to measure at the affective states, to try to get at proxies of affective states through these physiological measures. So if an individual, so we postulate that there's a rule, and then we invite an animal to violate the rule. So say a marshmallow test sort of situation, when no one's around watching, and is there heightened arousal when the individual is invited to violate a rule when no one's watching, for example. Thanks.
Right at the back there in the middle. Thank you for waiting patiently.
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk. My question is, when you're measuring normative regularity, would the process of habituation in itself be a social norm? And I say that in the context of I do a lot of work up north near Churchill, Manitoba, and there's this very, very unique pod of beluga whales who over the past 20 years have become extremely habituated to the people up there that go out on the boats and, on paddle boards and things. And to my knowledge, this is the only pod in all of Canada that is now desensitized to people. Other beluga whales, as soon as you go in the water, they, try to get away. But each year, as the beluga whales migrate to the Hudson's Bay, they bring their young, and over time, it's that teaching of their young that this is a safe place, and then the young grow up and bring their young. So would that in itself be a social norm, that process that has been happening over many, many years?
Yeah, it's such an interesting example. I think I'd want to look at the specific behaviors that the whales and the humans are engaged in to see if there are certain kinds of things we might describe as rules. Like, are there rules that the humans follow that they get only so close and not so close? Are there proxemics in this community?
Yes, so there are rules. You cannot engage with the whales, you can't touch the whales, you can't feed the whales. So there are specific rules that the humans are to follow. But what makes this pod unique is they will approach the humans. So I'm just curious if, given more information, if that would be a sense of social norm, because over time the behavior has been established in that community. That this is a behavior that this specific community does that we're not seeing in other communities.
Right. Yeah, I think I would love to talk to you more about this particular case, because I do think it sounds like it's a very promising place to look at this case of normative regularities. The social maintenance of teaching the young that this is a safe place seems pretty strong, pretty clear. Yeah. Thanks so much.
More shows of hands. You've been waiting patiently too in the middle.
Thanks a lot.
I think there's a mic coming your way.
Thanks a lot for your talk. I wanted to ask about one of the last points you made regarding using normative regularities to argue for the moral status of animals. So I just wanted to ask, do you think invoking normative regularities to argue for the moral status of animals runs the risk of isolating various sentient species that may not meet a specific cognitive or behavioral threshold? Or do you think normative regularities might actually be inherent to sentience?
Yeah, so thanks for asking that last question. So the answer to the last question is I kind of think so. And this is something I'm working on my own in a book project that I'm trying to get time to work on. Yeah, I do think that there's something essential to sentience that is deeply normative, and that the reason, reason why an organism is sentient to begin with is to know what's good and what's bad, what they ought to do, what they ought not do. And so I'm really strongly suspicious of oughts being more primitive than ises in cognitive systems, though in cognitive science, it's the kind of representational states that describe the world that get the prominence, and ought thoughts are thought to be these cognitive achievements. I think that might be backwards. But then to go back to the first part of your question, I'm a pluralist when it comes to almost everything, including ethics. And I just think that the normative regularity construct is another tool in the toolkit of thinking about how animals can be morally, have moral standing. But more importantly than that is that, right, if you have a sentient animal and you don't see any normative regularities there at all, and maybe you've got an animal that is truly solitary. I'm also skeptical about the idea that any species are truly solitary, but suppose there is. You would say, okay, then there's something I don't have to worry about. There's an interest I don't have to worry about. But for social animals, I think we need to say, hey, what are these hidden interests that might look really different from my interests, because they don't involve me feeling pain, and they don't involve harming my autonomy, but they involve me like losing something that's really important to like my community or my culture or something. It gives us another way of seeing things that we need to watch out for.
The solitary comment had me, I can remember, I'm going to be aging myself with this, I can remember some of the discussions coming out of animal behavioral studies. I think it was the end of the 20th century. Anyways, where they would have these conversations even about mammals, and it took a while for a number of feminist scientists to point out, wait a second, if you're talking about mammals, where is the mother fitting into the story with her infant or infants? Because that's a social space. So when you're talking about solitary versus non-solitary, that it was unsurprising in lots of ways. This has been disappeared, but it was an important moment to go, wait a second. Again, the importance of reframing, right? The importance of actually sitting, taking a deep breath, thinking about the ways that we're construing certain behavior, whether it be of our own species or others, and the importance of re-seeing through reframing, which is basically lots of what you're doing here.
Yeah, Anne Russin, orangutan researcher out of York, where I am, would often say, oh, people say orangutans are semi-social. But they're social. They're just social like we were up in the prairies where you only see each other once a week when you go to church. They're different ways of being social.
Yeah, thanks. So more questions. I will ask that cricket question if no one else asks it. So up at the back. Up at the back. Or sorry.
Thank you so much. This is maybe a question about disciplines of study, perhaps not specifically about what you said, but where your work relates to others. And the question I'm thinking of is that the slide you started with had the word human, right, and you crossed it out. So it seems like the scholars you're engaging with are looking for behaviors that can kind of fit into what human behavior or norms might look like. Is there a separate sort of set of scholars working out there who are not using human-derived terms to describe animal behavior? Is that even possible? I guess I'm wondering what are we missing and not capturing by using seemingly human-derived concepts and expectations? And so it's just more like a meta question about what do these fields and related fields look like, and who's doing what and why?
Great. Yeah, it's a great question. So I have a little book called How to Study Animal Minds that came from hanging out with my scientist friends for a long time and talking to them about the methods that are used in the science. And one of the things that the scientists all agree on, I think, is that you shouldn't anthropomorphize your animal subjects. So what does that mean? You shouldn't be using a human lens, you shouldn't be using human concepts, and then at the same time recognizing, well, all we can do is use a human lens and a human concepts because we're humans. So we've got this tension, there's no view from nowhere, and yet we want to try to get into the umwelt of the animal and see things from their perspective as much as possible. And I think it's a dance that a lot of people do really nicely. The ethologists, the classical ethologists are some of the scientists who did this really well and thought that this was really important, going out and living with animals in their natural communities, observing them for a really long time. I just watched Signals for Survival for the first time the other day, which is highly recommended if you find it. It's on YouTube. I think it's still the BBC documentary based on film that Tinbergen made of gulls and gull communicative behaviors. Now, Tinbergen spent a lot of time just watching gulls do their thing and was able to understand them, understand their different communicative signals. But we are constrained by our physiology and by our concepts. So yeah, it's a struggle.
Can I just jump in there on the anthropomorphism too? Because it's not a term I like. It comes in the classical Greek tradition. This is a compound term. It comes out of classical Greek philosophers criticizing classical Greek religion. I think it's a term that should have stayed there because it makes more sense there. But here, I mean, my worry about anthropomorphism as a term is that it front and centers this in a way that's question-begging and problematic. And once again, assuming that we're some kind of supernatural contrast class, we're not great apes or animals. In fact, one of the ways to test yourself as to whether you're comfortable with this or not is if I said to you, you're just an animal, would you have a visceral response? Because you are just an animal. You're meat all the way through. There's nothing spooky in there. I worry about this. I worry about the notion of anthropomorphism. I know you do too. But just to flag it, I mean, I worry that itself has built into it this notion of humans as some kind of supernatural contrast class that doesn't make a lot of sense. Doesn't tend to come up with anatomy. Doesn't tend to come up with physiology. Doesn't even tend to come up with neuroscience when you're talking about the gross morphologies of brains. And then once you get into the functional functions of the brains, then we start playing around with the term anthropomorphism, and I think that's a tell, because I think that's a political move. It's not one that's based in a great deal of concern. Anyways, you were waiting patiently to. You don't have a question? Do you want me to ask the cricket question? I can ask the cricket.
There's a question right here.
Oh, sure,
Sorry.
Go for it. You got a mic coming.
I accept the notion that you have to, as humans, we don't really have another perspective to bring to things except our human perspective. So we can't really speak ape, or maybe we'd be able to do it in our studies, but we don't have that facility. But there's an aspect of this particular construct that really concerns me, and that is the requirement for punishment. Now, that is a fundamentally human idea regarding how we raise people, how we interact in society. But in addition to that, I can't imagine that we actually are capable of observing the multitude forms of punishment that could occur in the animal species. And in particular, I just finished reading What a Fish Knows. And of course, the study of trying to, observe types of punishment or, the normative behavior, social behavior is profoundly difficult. It may even occur, in human society. We have punishment that occurs over decades or generationally, as in the statements we're now making about indigenous land. which deserves, some considerable generational imposition and response. We have no idea if animals are doing the same thing because we can't see it. So I find that particular aspect as being a criteria for whatever purpose, whether it's to legitimize their rights or anything else. I find that very, very troubling in the general construct.
Yeah, I take that criticism, and I think there are two things I want to say in response to that. One is that what I hope to do is shift the null hypothesis over time. So right now the null hypothesis is that animals don't have social norms. And so you have to have positive evidence before you can conclude that they do. Now, your point about how to find that positive evidence, I think I just need to reassert that punishment isn't necessary for normative regularity on my view. And I'm critical of people who think punishment is a requirement. In fact, I think that what I call positive social maintenance probably plays a much more important role. Things like teaching and pedagogy and praise for doing things right plays a more important role. But your point still stands. That's hard to see. That's going to be really hard to see I'm thinking of plants. I'm thinking of sponge spores. I'm thinking of animals and plants, living things that are very different from us.
Do your colleagues agree with you? Do you have, in terms of the, approach that's being taken, are you in the vanguard, or is there a general agreement around that?
About flipping the null?
Well, I'm not entirely clear of like how widely this punishment notion is an accepted like requirement, if it's something that's pretty much presumed, or if it's open for debate, or if there's
the punishment.
The punishment camp. There you go.
So I think that I don't know either. I read a lot. I think that there's a range of views. So I read a lot of people as saying punishment is required, and those are the kinds of folks that I highlighted in the talk. But I just got a referee report from one of these papers under review who said, no, in fact, a lot of people don't think punishment is an integral part of social norms. So there's a diversity of views out there. Yeah.
Well, thanks. Thank you.
Show of hands again.
Thanks. So I'm not sure that I completely got what your definition of conformity would be, but most people would say conformity is copying behaviors beyond what you would do just based on information. In that case, would you say that any example of conformity is potentially a social norm?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't. So, for example, here's a conformity behavior that humans engage in. Maybe this wouldn't be conformity on your definition, but here's a pattern of behavior that I wouldn't count as a social norm in humans, and that is like carrying a water bottle on a hot day. So we all individually, or many of us individually, have a desire to drink water. We carry water bottles, they're everywhere, but nobody's really looking askance at anyone who's not carrying a water bottle, except maybe your mother if you're a toddler or something. So it's the sort of example of something where everyone just happens to have the same interest. So the robber barter case, if it's the case that the monkeys don't care what anyone else is doing, and they're just like, oh, here's a way for me to get some food, then that wouldn't count as a normative regularity on our view. But it's a candidate, right? So anytime there's a pattern, you've got something like, oh, maybe this is a normative regularity. Let's look for the other piece. I might have a different account of what a pattern is than conformity. We can talk about that.
Show of hands. This might be our last question. We're at 10:26.
Right. Thanks. Make it a good one. Yeah. So thanks for a wonderful presentation. I just want to state that my background is philosophy and psychology. And in terms of my question, I'm just going to read it because otherwise I'll get confused about it because it's a long one. So we look to similarities between animals and humans to try to determine if we have a case for moral equivalence in terms of the distinction between animals and people. And I'm just wondering if there's something in here that could help us justify allocation of moral equivalence to humans whose cognitive prowess, let's say, is altered, such as people with dementia, who I work with, through theories of personhood and agency. What can we sort of take from this today, your talk, to bring it to the population of people with, let's say, disabilities, for lack of a better word?
Yeah, and that's a good question. I haven't actually thought about this question, but it's something I should think about. So this is just my initial response, would be that I think that the social norm framework would be more inclusive than capacities frameworks would be, because the kind of capacities that are required for being a part of a community might end up being just relationships, right? And the relationships might be other people towards the individual. Will make the individual be part of that community. And because there are different sorts of, in communities, different kind of roles that one play depending on their status in the community, norms can differ for different individuals depending on their differing abilities and capacities. So I think it would be really amenable to avoiding some of the criticisms that come about capacities views that Andrew and I have struggled with in the past when talking about chimpanzee personhood. Yeah, so thanks for the question. Thanks for inviting me to think more about that.
And so thanks to everybody for the conversation. Thanks for that super last question. It, hits the high threshold for good last questions. And thank you so much for this participation. Thank you for Dr. Andrews and her presentation and taking the time to do this.
Yeah, thank you all for the comments and questions and conversations. Great.